The class mocked why Deathworld girls are feared. She replied, "We don't fight to hurt, we fight to end." The question hung in the air before anyone moved to answer it. 300 cadets from 47 species sat in the steep rows of the amphitheater, and not one of them made a sound. Data tablets had become suddenly very interesting. A Vraxian in the third row was studying the edge of his seat. A pair of Centurions near the back had gone still in the particular way people go still when they want to appear occupied without committing to anything specific. Professor Velka let the silence run. She stood at the center platform with her forearms clasped behind her, her four eyes doing a slow sweep from the left stairs to the right. Her mandibles clicked once, a small, dry sound that carried clearly in the quiet. She had been teaching combined doctrine for 11 years. She knew what this silence meant. It meant the room was hoping someone else would step forward first. "The question," she said again, "is not rhetorical. Humanity has produced no orbital platforms capable of cracking moons. Their computational warfare capability is outmatched by at least 6 species in this room. Their fleet tonnage places them in the second tier of galactic military power." And yet her mandibles clicked a second time. Every senior military commander I have ever spoken to from 4 separate interstellar powers has named them first when asked which species they least want to fight. Why? A cadet near the front raised his hand. Velka nodded. "Superior weapons technology," the cadet said. "They punch above their weight class through. Their personal sidearms are plasma-based, standard issue, nothing your forces don't already field." Velka cut him off without heat. "Their ship-to-ship armaments fall within normal galactic parameters. Their electronic countermeasures are innovative but not decisive." She paused. "Try again." The cadet sat down. Silence returned. From the back of the hall, someone stood up. She had not stood dramatically. She was already standing, the way people stand when they've been deciding something for the last 60 seconds and have just finished deciding. She was compact, dark-haired, with the unhurried bearing of someone who had already calculated every exit in the room and found them all manageable. The scars were what the nearest cadets noticed first, thin silver lines along her jawline, catching the amphitheater's overhead light before anyone had processed what she'd said. "Because," she said, "we don't fight to win, we fight to end things." Her voice was calm, carrying easily without being raised, and every word of that sentence matters. 300 faces turned to look at her. She walked down the stairs the way she moved everywhere, without hurrying, without performing. Each bootfall echoed off the amphitheater's curved walls. Velka stepped aside to give her the platform, and there was something deliberate in that, the way a curator steps back from an exhibit. "Lieutenant Maya Reeves," Velka said to the room, "combat veteran, assigned to this academy as part of the Joint Exchange Program. She has agreed to speak with us this morning." A pause, informally. Maya reached the platform and turned to face the room. A Centurion cadet in the middle rows had crystalline features the color of cool, polished ice, the natural shade his kind wore in easy confidence. He was watching Maya with the particular attention of someone who has already decided how something is going to go and is simply waiting for the evidence to confirm it. His name was Krellel. Velka had noted him before the session began, top of his tactical cohort, fluent in 3 doctrinal frameworks, and absolutely certain that military history was a subject he had already mastered. "You'll start with the Yawn Dominion," Maya said. She was not looking at a tablet. 17 systems, expanding at the rate of 1 conquest every 6 to 8 months. Kepler 9 was a colony of 2,000 people. 60% were killed in the opening strike. The Yawn used kinetic impactors on a civilian settlement. They made no distinction between military and non-military targets. For them, those categories were the same thing. She let that land for a moment. In the front row, a Peltoran cadet's hands had gone very still in her lap. The council opened negotiation channels, standard protocol, acceptable casualty thresholds, armistice terms, ceasefire zones. Maya's tone did not change. The Dominion declined. They were 6 months into their campaign. Momentum favors the aggressor, and they knew it. A beat. Humanity declined to negotiate. Krellel raised his hand. "Surely," he said, with the measured precision of someone who considers themselves to be offering a reasonable correction. The outcome you're describing is simply the result of superior positioning. Resources, alliances the yawn failed to anticipate. Maya looked at him. The yawn dominion as a functioning civilization no longer exists, she said. Not as a military power, not as a government, not as a species with a homeworld. 6 months from the attack on Kepler 9 to civilizational dissolution. No allies helped. No resources were decisive. Do you want me to walk through it step by step, or are you going to offer another explanation first? Krell's features stayed white. He lowered his hand. The Galactic Council, Maya continued, called it excessive. I was in the room for that conversation. She tilted her head slightly. I pointed out that there had been 0 deliberate strikes on human civilian populations in the 80 years since. I asked them to tell me when the yawn's preferred method had produced a comparable result. She paused. They moved on to the next agenda item. Velka, standing to the side, said nothing. Her mandibles did not click. She was watching the room the way a clinician watches a test she already knows the outcome of. Psychological warfare, Krell said, when Maya opened the floor. That's the more honest framing for what you're describing. The reputation itself is the weapon. You've built a deterrence doctrine on the credible threat of extreme action. It's not categorically different from what a dozen other species have attempted. The threat works, Maya said, because the action has occurred. Once, Krell said, arguably, the historical record is contested. Maya looked at him for a moment, just a moment. You want a more recent example? It was not a question. The Keltine threshold. She set her hands on the platform edge. The scars on her jaw caught the light again, the silver lines faint and precise, like something drawn by someone who knew exactly where to cut. 5 million colonists. Agricultural world, low strategic value, which is why the biological weapons were creative. The Keltine chose them specifically because the suffering would be prolonged and public. They wanted an example. Her voice had dropped slightly. Not to a whisper, but quieter. The cadets in the farthest rows were leaning forward without seeming to realize it. The evacuation shelters were sealed. That was the design. Children died in sealed evacuation shelters. The amphitheater was completely still. The Keltine command offered terms, Maya said. They wanted the threshold worlds, the outer colonies. They said civilian targets would stop once the territorial demands were met. Her hands left the platform edge. Humanity told them no. A cadet near the center said, quietly, what happened to the Keltine? Their homeworld, Maya said. Every colony, every outpost, every ship capable of reaching another system. There was nothing mutual about it. A beat. The Keltine had chosen to make survival the cost of surrender. We made the calculation they hadn't accounted for, that there are situations where acceptable losses include your own. She paused. They thought they were negotiating. They were not negotiating. In the middle rows, Krell's crystalline features had shifted to the edge of something. Not dark yet, but the easy white of confident calm was no longer quite there. From behind him, a Vraxian cadet said slowly, that sounds like revenge. Maya turned to look at her. 80 years, she said. Not one deliberate strike on a human civilian population in 80 years. From any power, that is not revenge. That is the outcome. She waited a beat. Is there a species in this room that can say the same? No one answered. The silence had changed. It was not the silence of a room waiting for someone to speak. It was the silence of a room that has started doing arithmetic and doesn't like the numbers. Krell's features were still not dark, but they were not white anymore. They had gone slightly translucent. The way Centurion pigmentation shifted when the confidence signal was no longer receiving clean input. He was, Velka observed from her post at the side of the platform, doing what intelligent cadets did when testimony refused to fit their framework, looking for the flaw in the methodology because the alternative meant revising something larger. Barbaric, he said at last. The word came out carefully, as though he'd considered several others first. I mean that structurally, not as an insult. The doctrine you're describing belongs to an earlier phase of development. Civilized species evolve past it. Multi-party arbitration, proportional response. These aren't weaknesses, They're what distinguishes advanced societies from civilization, Maya said, is the agreement not to use maximum force. She let that sentence sit for exactly one beat. It is not the inability to. Those two things are not the same, and the moment you mistake one for the other, you have made the Keltines error. Krell said nothing. Every species in this room has the capacity to cause large-scale harm, Maya said. You have all chosen through law and treaty and social norm not to. That choice is civilization. It is a real choice, which means it is a choice that can be unmade. The question is not whether you are capable of extreme action. The question is what it would take. She looked at him steadily. For most species, the answer involves something negotiable. Resources, territory, status, something that can be traded. A pause. For humans, the answer is not negotiable. It is a threshold. Below it, we are the most cooperative, patient, and restrained allies you will find. Above it, she stopped. She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. In the front row, the Peltoran cadet's hands were folded tightly in her lap now, her large, dark eyes fixed on Maya's face. The Vraxian in the third row had put his tablet down. Krell's features had finally shifted, just slightly, toward the cooler side of his natural spectrum. Not dark, not quite. But not white anymore either. Velka let 30 seconds pass before she spoke. I'll note, she said to the room, that the psychological profiling requirement built into our joint deployment protocols, the mandatory evaluation before any human allied unit can be embedded with non-human forces, was not written by humans. It was written by us. Her mandibles clicked once. Specifically, it was written by the same council that called the yawn outcome excessive. They wrote it 6 months later. Another click. I'll let you draw your own conclusions about what changed in those 6 months. Krell had his hands folded on his desk. His features were translucent, the pigmentation in a state that Velka recognized from other cadets in other sessions, the specific color of a model under pressure, not broken, under pressure. He raised his hand. Maya looked at him. Is this, Krell said, with the deliberateness of someone choosing each word, is this actually doctrine? Or are you describing the actions of specific individuals, specific incidents, and framing them as representative of something systematic? Maya was quiet for a moment. The yawn conflict, she said, was systematic. The Keltine response was systematic. The treaty clauses that govern how our forces may be deployed were written by your governments in direct response to what they had observed. She reached up, a small, unhurried gesture, and touched the silver scars along her jaw with 2 fingers, not performing the gesture, just touching them the way you touch something you've stopped noticing until you notice it again. And then there is the evidence that is not systematic, she said, the evidence that is personal. The room had gone very still. She had not said what the personal evidence was. She left the sentence standing like an open door. Across the hall, 300 cadets were looking at those scars. Stay close. What she's about to say, I have heard once. I needed to hear it twice to understand what it meant. Beat 2 had not finished. The open door was still open. The scars caught the amphitheater light, and Krell's features held their translucent, pressured color, and the room was waiting. Maya had not told them about the diplomatic vessel yet. Maya's hands came down from the platform edge. The diplomatic vessel, she said, was called the Veryl's Promise. Cultural exchange mission, mixed crew, 8 civilian council members aboard including a Peltoran attaché and her 2 younglings. She said it simply, the way you state facts you have said before and have not yet found a way to stop carrying. We were 3 days out from the Drevath system when the slavers came alongside, 12 of them. They wanted the council members for ransom and they wanted the humans for fighting rings. Those were different line items on the same transaction. The Peltoran cadet in the front row had gone very still. The commanding officer was shot in front of everyone, Maya said. He was trying to explain the treaty protections on diplomatic staff. They shot him mid-sentence. A pause. The younglings were separated from their mother while the crew watched. The slavers were establishing what the costs of resistance would look like. The amphitheater was the quietest Velka had heard it in 11 years of sessions. I described earlier, Maya said, The threshold, the point below which we are cooperative, patient, restrained, the point above which we are something else. She did not look at Krell. She looked at nothing in particular, the way people look when they are checking a memory they have checked before. I crossed it, alone. I went through the ship from stern to bow and I cleared it. A beat, some of them quickly. She stopped. Some of them, she said, not quickly. In the front row, the Peltoran cadet's large dark eyes were wet. She was not the only one. The Peltoran attaché and her younglings were unharmed, Maya said. Her voice had not changed register. It was still calm, still even, still the voice of someone reporting something that happened rather than something she felt. All 12 threats were neutralized. The mission continued. She looked at the room now properly, taking in the 300 faces. I want to be clear about something. I am not telling you this because it is a story I am proud of. I am telling you because it is evidence. It is a data point you need to understand the doctrine. Silence. I became something different after that, she said. Not just to the enemy, to everyone, including myself. Her hands were still resting at her sides. That knowledge, what you are capable of, what you have already done, is not something you put down when the situation is resolved. You carry it. A pause. That is the cost. And in the doctrine, the cost is considered. It is factored in. We do not pretend it is not a cost. She stopped talking. Krell raised his hand. He lowered it again. He seemed to think better of whatever he had been about to say, because the question that came out of his mouth instead was quieter than anything he had said before. Have you, he said, have you flipped the switch? Is that something that has happened to you personally, or are you speaking theoretically? Maya looked at him. Yes, she said, once. Krell's crystalline features went dark, not the color of distress, darker than that. The color Velka associated with a foundational model encountering data that it had been built to exclude. He said nothing else. The room did not fill the silence. Nobody offered a counter. Nobody reached for the propaganda framing or the barbaric species framing or the psychological warfare argument. The room had done its arithmetic quietly somewhere in the last 4 minutes and had arrived at a number it was not in a hurry to share out loud. Velka stepped forward. Lieutenant Reeves's account, she said, is consistent with the classified after-action record, which I have read in full. Her mandibles clicked once, not amusement this time, something more formal. It is also consistent with why this academy requires mandatory psychological profiling before any human allied unit is embedded with non-human forces. That protocol was not requested by humanity. It was written by the Galactic Council. Specifically at the request of 4 military commanders who had worked alongside human forces and wanted their language, a structured framework for understanding what they were standing next to. She paused. The profiling is not to protect you from humans who have flipped the switch. It is to ensure that when you work alongside one, you understand the weight of what they are carrying, and you treat that accordingly. A Vraxian cadet, near the middle, had one hand pressed flat against his desk, as though checking that the surface was still there. The term used in the treaty clauses, Velka continued, is the extinction capability threshold. It has a formal designation. It is referenced in the Mutual Defense Compact that 11 interstellar powers have signed, and it is referenced nowhere in our standard curriculum. Her 4 eyes moved across the room. That is not an accident. It is a choice this institution made, and it is a choice I have been reconsidering for some time. Another click. Which is why Lieutenant Reeves is standing on this platform. The simulation center was 3 floors down. Instructor Dravix met them at the door, forearmed, Corin-built, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades watching other people make decisions under pressure and had long ago stopped being surprised by the outcomes. He was broad in the way that suggested load-bearing, with a voice that came from somewhere low and took its time arriving. You're the group, he said, looking at the cadets filing in. It was not a question. He looked at Maya last. Lieutenant. Instructor. He stepped aside and let them through. The simulation center held 20 pods arranged in a rough oval, each one a sealed neural interface unit that created environments indistinguishable from live deployment. Dravix ran his sessions here the way other instructors ran written exams. He watched the biometric feeds from the observation booth above, reading the cadets' stress signatures, decision latency, and threat response curves in real time. He had seen every pattern of failure the room could produce. He had a taxonomy for them. Maya stood at the center of the oval. 10 cadets selected from the amphitheater session, Krell among them, features still carrying that cooler shade. Sir, a Vraxian technical specialist who moved with the deliberate economy of someone who disliked wasted motion. Rhea, a Peltoran who was going to be exceptional at this in about 4 years and was not exceptional yet. The rest were a mixed spread. Standard rescue scenario, Maya said. Station under hostile control. 3,000 inhabitants, mixed species. Hostile force holds the evacuation systems. You have 1 hour before a reactor meltdown initiates. The hostiles have rigged a manual trigger, so standard protocols for core shutdown don't apply. Your objective is civilian evacuation, not engagement. She looked at them. Questions. Rules of engagement, Krell asked. Minimize casualties, preserve the mission. Non-lethal takedowns authorized. Authorized. He nodded. He was thinking tactically. Velka could see it from the booth above, through the observation glass, laying the scenario across his trained framework. Clean breach, controlled engagement, systematic clearance. He had done this kind of scenario before. He was good at it. He had never done this kind of scenario, with Maya's modifications running underneath. Dravix settled into the booth chair and pulled up the biometric array. 14 readouts scrolled across the main display, 10 cadets, Maya standing outside the pods, and 2 instructor feeds. He watched the cadets' heart rates normalize as the neural interface settled. Standard pre-entry calibration, clean numbers. This goes the way I think it's going to go, he said quietly, to no one in particular. Maya, standing at the edge of the array, said nothing. The simulation opened. The cadets moved well. Krell took point with the natural authority of someone used to being trusted, his 3-person breach team working the main docking corridor with the kind of textbook precision that would have earned full marks in a standard evaluation. Sir's technical team secured the secondary access routes. Rhea's fire support element held the junction near the reactor corridor, exactly where the scenario geometry suggested they should be. Dravix watched the biometrics, steady, coordinated, properly trained cadets executing a plan they had built together in 60 seconds, which was faster than most. He watched the meltdown alarm trigger. He watched the execution order fire simultaneously in the station plaza, 3 hostages, in the 3-second window between the alarm and the cadets' first breach confirmation. Not 1, 3. He watched Krell's heart rate spike 14 points. The thing about decision-making under pressure Dravix had learned over decades in this booth was that it was not the hard decisions that broke people. It was the decisions that required you to choose between 2 things your training had told you were equally important. Non-lethal engagement protocol, trained in, tested, evaluated. Hostage preservation, trained in, tested, evaluated. The scenario did not care which one was currently giving you more points. The scenario simply made them incompatible. Krell split his forces. It was the trained response. Dravix watched him make the call without hesitation, Sir's team to the plaza, his own team continuing the docking bay breach. Clean command decision, prioritize both. A reasonable choice that would have been correct in any of the 17 other scenarios in the Academy's standard rotation. Maya had written Scenario 18. Sir's team hit concentrated resistance at the plaza junction. The hostile force had read the split and waited against it. Krell's breach team cleared the first docking bay with non-lethal takedowns. 4 hostiles secured and immobilized, 4.5 seconds of their windows spent. The second bay was the same. Dravix watched the evacuation numbers. The civilians were moving, but the pace was wrong. The hostiles were using the secured prisoner management as drag. Every secured prisoner was a resource cost the team hadn't planned for. In the booth, the meltdown counter ticked. Krell called for status. Sir's team called back. They were pinned. The technical specialist who was supposed to disable the detonator was separated from the detonator by a wall of concentrated fire that had not appeared in any standard scenario geometry. Rhea's team was holding the reactor corridor, doing that well, buying time that was being spent faster than it was being bought. The cadet team held 2 conversations out loud when they should have been holding 0. Dravix watched the biometric collapse. Not panic, these were trained officers. They did not panic in the screaming sense. What they did was the subtler failure. Decision latency climbed, each call taking 0.3 of a second longer than the last, which in a scenario that was burning through its margins was a kind of arithmetic that only ran one direction. The meltdown alarm moved to its final phase. The simulation did not let them finish the evacuation. The pods opened. The cadets came out in the slow, deliberate way of people who have just experienced something their nervous systems have not yet filed correctly. Krell sat on the edge of his pod for a moment. His features were dark, not the searching dark of a model under pressure, but something quieter and more fundamental. The dark of a person who has just watched something fail that they were certain would not fail. Sir stood near the wall. She had her arms crossed and was looking at the floor, not in shame, but with the focused expression of someone already running a reconstruction. Rhea looked physically ill. She was not the only one. 47 civilians evacuated, Maya said, reading from the scenario summary. Station destroyed. Remaining hostage population lost. All cadet personnel neutralized by secondary hostile elements during the final phase. Total loss. She let it be total loss for a moment. She did not soften it. Pull up the docking bay feed, she said to Dravix. Bay 1, the first 40 seconds. Dravix keyed the holographic display above the pod array. The footage ran, Krell's team working well, moving cleanly. The first hostile engaged with a non-lethal immobilizer, a precise, controlled shot. The hostile went down. Another team member moved to secure him, bind the restraints, verify incapacitation, move him clear of the corridor. Stop there, Maya said. The image froze. How long was that? Krell looked at the timestamp. 6 seconds, he said. For one hostile, in a corridor where you needed to clear and evacuate in under a minute. Maya looked at the frozen image. Every second you spent securing that prisoner was a second you didn't spend moving civilians toward the shuttle bays. That is the trade you made. It felt like the right trade because your training told you it was the right trade. She let him look at the image. Now I'm going to show you something else. The recording was labeled with a Terran Fleet designation and a date, roughly 3 years prior, a station seizure in a system that most of the cadets in the room had never heard of, involving a hostage situation with a structure almost identical to the one they had just failed. She had built the scenario from the after-action file. The Marines in the footage moved differently. That was the first thing, not faster, necessarily more committed. The distinction Dravix had spent a career trying to articulate and had mostly stopped trying because the words always came out wrong. Not faster, more committed. Each second allocated at the moment of allocation, not reconsidered. The first docking bay went in 8 seconds. Not because the Marines were better shots or had superior training. Their equipment was standard, their techniques were in the manual. Because they made a different calculation at the moment of first contact, and they made it cleanly, without committee. Krell was watching the footage, with his dark features very still. The plaza, 6 shots in 3 seconds. No secured prisoners. The evacuation team pivoted instantly to the shuttle bay, the combat element falling back to cover the corridor without a word of coordination audible on the audio feed. The coordination had already happened in the pre-breach briefing for exactly this contingency. The final shuttle launched with civilians packed beyond rated capacity, every safety protocol in the Unified Handbook violated sequentially without hesitation. 6 Marines sealed themselves in vacuum suits, manual launch. The station came apart behind them. All 6 were recovered. Dravix watched the cadets, watching the recording. Question, said the Vraxian technical specialist, Sir, who had been running her reconstruction since she stepped out of the pod. They didn't attempt to immobilize the hostiles in the plaza. No, Maya said. That's a doctrine question then, not a tactics question. Yes. Sir nodded slowly. She was not approving or disapproving. She was updating a file. Tours, Maya said. Lieutenant Commander Sella Tours. She held the station's hospital wing for 6 hours with 30 soldiers against 300 hostile personnel. Her people were improvising defensive positions from medical equipment, running triage on the wounded while they fought, buying time for the civilian population to be moved floor by floor to the shuttle bays. A pause. 28 of her 30 were wounded. Tours herself was shot 4 times, 0 civilian casualties. She looked at the cadets. Dravix was part of the reinforcement team that reached the station. 30 faces turned to the booth. Dravix said from above, "I was." His voice carried the weight of someone who has confirmed a fact they have confirmed before and does not consider confirming it a performance. "I have seen what 6 hours in a hospital wing looks like afterward. It looks like a cost paid in full." Krellel was very still. "You're going to run the scenario again," Maya said. "Same parameters, difficulty increased." "Difficulty increased how?" Krellel asked. "You'll find out when it starts," Maya said. He looked at her for a moment, then he climbed back into his pod. The others followed. There was no discussion this time, no pre-entry conference, no audible framework building. They went in with the particular quiet of people who have just watched themselves fail and have already started the reconstruction. Sir was the last one in. She paused at the edge of her pod, looked at the frozen holographic image of the marine footage still hanging above the array, then sealed the interface. Dravix, in the booth, pulled up the biometric array. The numbers settled differently this time. Resting heart rate slightly elevated, not fear, exactly. The specific physiology of people who have already paid attention and are now paying more. He said quietly to Maya through the booth comm, 20% harder. "Yes," she said. "That's a certification-level scenario for this cohort." "Yes," she said again. He let it go and watched the feeds. The simulation opened on the same station, the same layout, the same hostile count. Maya's modifications were already running under the surface, invisible until they weren't. Krellel did not take point in the docking corridor the same way. He moved to the front of the breach stack and looked at the corridor for 3 seconds. Dravix watched the biometric, heart rate steady, decision latency running clean. Then Krellel said quietly to his team, "No prisoners. Evacuation mode from the first contact. We are not here to fight, we are here to move people." A pause. "If something is between us and the civilians, we remove it. Minimum time." 3 seconds of silence from the team. Sir said, "Understood." They went in. The first docking bay went in under 10 seconds. Not 8, they were not human marines, and their biology ran different response curves, but under 10, which for a cadet team at this level was not a number the Academy's evaluators would have predicted. The corridor cleared. The evacuation route opened. The civilians started moving. Dravix watched the meltdown counter. He watched the cadet team's route choices. They were doing something he had not seen a non-human team do at this level without specific cross-species training. They were making the human calculation, not copying it, adapting it, finding the version that fit their own response speeds and combat biology. Krellel called the route changes in clipped lines. No committee, no debate. The meltdown alarm triggered. The execution order fired in the plaza. Krellel did not split his forces. Dravix leaned forward. He had watched 100 iterations of the scenario he had built for this session over 8 years, across dozens of cohorts, and he had never seen a non-human team respond to the simultaneous alarm and execution trigger without the split-force reflex. The reflex was trained in deep. It was the rational response to 2 simultaneous threats, and it was wrong here because the scenario was designed around the math that the split produced, 2 weakened elements, neither sufficient for its task, burning through the margin together. Krellel pulled his element back from the secondary corridor and redirected them toward the plaza, not splitting, redirecting. One concentrated force, the evacuation element covering their withdrawal. The plaza, Sir's technical specialist, reached the detonator housing through a route that should have been under fire, because the hostile concentration that was supposed to be there was responding to Krell's consolidated push instead of holding its position. She had 20 seconds. She used 14. The detonator disarmed. Krell's element hit the plaza in the window that the disarmed detonator had bought them. Dravix watched the biometric on the hostile engagement sequence. It was not the same as the Marine recording. It was not supposed to be. It was a Centurion leading a mixed-species team, using the logic they had just been given and translating it into the tools they actually had. The evacuation route opened to the primary shuttle bay. In the booth, Dravix said nothing. He watched the civilian count moving. He watched the shuttle bay access clear. He watched Krell's team run the final corridor with the kind of focus that looked, from the biometric feeds, like absolute clarity, the specific signature that appeared in experienced officers who had stopped arguing with the situation and started working with what was actually in front of them. The final shuttle loaded. Krell looked at the head count and looked at the shuttle capacity, and Dravix watched the half-second pause in his biometric where he ran the math and arrived at the same answer the human Marines had arrived at. "Everyone in," Krell said, "now." They packed the shuttle, every safety rating exceeded, every protocol in the Unified Handbook set aside in sequence without ceremony. The station came apart 6 seconds after the shuttle cleared. The simulation dissolved. 0 casualties. Dravix read it off the scenario summary before anyone had fully processed being back in the simulation center. He read it the way he read all summary data, plainly, without performance, and then he set the tablet down and was quiet for a moment. The cadets were coming out of their pods with expressions he did not see often in this room. Not relief, exactly, not pride. Something that came before pride, the specific state of a person who has just done something they were not sure they could do and is not yet certain what it means. Krell stood with his hands at his sides. His crystalline features had shifted out of the dark they had held since the slaver testimony. They were settling toward silver, the Centurion color Dravix associated with the rarest outcome of any training session. Not satisfaction, not relief, respect, the involuntary kind, the kind that came from direct experience rather than assessment. He was looking at Maya. Maya was reviewing the simulation data on a secondary display, her back half turned to the room. She did not make a moment of it. Dravix came down from the booth. High 2, the mundane beat before the turn. He poured water from the carafe on the side table, a habit from years of post-simulation debriefs. He did it without thinking about it. He handed a cup to Sir, who took it without looking, and set another on the edge of the nearest pod, housing for anyone who wanted it. He stood with his own cup, not drinking from it, looking at the scenario summary. "Clean breach timing on both bays," he said, to the room and to no one. "Communication count dropped 70% from the first run." He looked up. "That is the number that mattered." He set the cup down. "Lieutenant Reeves," he said, "your assessment." Maya turned from the display. She looked at the cadets, at the 12 of them ranged around the oval, some still sitting on their pod edges, Krell standing, Sir with her arms uncrossed for the first time since the first run ended. She looked at them the way she had looked at the amphitheater, as though taking inventory. "You did 3 things right," she said. "You recognized the moment the situation changed. You trusted your training enough to act on incomplete information. And you found solutions that were yours. You did not try to be the Marines in the recording. You used the lesson and built your own answer with it. A beat. That is the correct application." Krell moved. He squared his shoulders, and his features settled fully into silver, and he came to attention, formally, precisely, the Centurion military posture that Dravix had seen maybe a dozen times in this room across his career, always from cadets who had arrived at something the hard way. "Instructor Reeves," Krell said, "I owe you an apology." The room went quiet. "I called your lecture propaganda," he said. "I want to be precise about what I meant and why I was wrong. I meant that the capabilities you described were exaggerated for psychological effect, that the doctrine was a tool, not a description of reality. I understand now that you were not exaggerating. He paused. You were being honest about a difficult truth, and I treated your honesty as a manipulation. I was wrong to do that. He was not performing it. His features stayed silver, his voice stayed level. He had reached the concession through the evidence inside his own experience, not through being corrected, and there was a difference, and the room could feel the difference. Maya said, apology accepted. She said it the same way she said everything, no ceremony, no warmth that was more than the situation warranted. You made better decisions in the second run. That's the point of the exercise. Dravix from behind Krellel said, agreed. The cadets were filing toward the door when Surta, the Peltoran cadet who had been watching Maya's scars since the amphitheater, stopped near the threshold and turned back. Instructor Reeves, she said, do you think we will need to use this? For real? She meant the doctrine, the calculation, the thing Krellel had called propaganda and then apologized for calling propaganda, not the tactics, the other thing. Maya looked at her. I hope not, she said. Hope is not a strategy, but I mean it anyway. Surta nodded. She seemed to be deciding whether to say something else. She decided not to. She left. The simulation center was nearly empty now. Dravix was logging the session data in the booth. The holographic display still held the last frame of the marine recording, the shuttle clear of the station coming apart in its wake. Maya had not cleared it. Krellel was still there. He was standing near his pod, not quite ready to leave, with the expression of someone who has more to say and is not certain they should say it. His features had shifted from silver to a color Dravix had no formal name for, something between silver and the color Centurions wore in private moments they had not prepared for. Lieutenant Reeves, he said, may I ask you something? Maya looked at him. The slavers, he said, you said some of them not quickly. He stopped. Do you still see them, the ones you? He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. The simulation center was very quiet. Maya did not answer immediately. She looked at the holographic frame of the shuttle still hanging above the pod array. The station, mid-dissolution, frozen in the display. Then she looked at Krellel. Every single one, she said. The question hung in the air, the way his first challenge had hung in the amphitheater, but this was not the same silence. That silence had been a room waiting for someone to prove something. This silence was something smaller and more specific. One cadet, understanding for the first time that the weight Maya had been describing all morning was not a rhetorical device. It was weight she was carrying right now. Krellel's features were the unnamed color. How do you, he started. I'll answer that in the debrief, Maya said, not here. She said it without sharpness, but the door was closed, clearly and without malice, and Krellel understood it and nodded once and moved toward the exit. He paused at the threshold. He did not turn around. The protocol, he said, the psychological profiling before human units can be embedded. He was quiet for a moment. It's not just to prepare the non-human personnel, is it? It was not a question. Maya said nothing. Krellel left. Dravix came down from the booth. The session log was complete. He set the tablet on the side table next to the water carafe and stood with his forearms settled at his sides in the particular posture that meant he had something to say and was taking his time arriving at it. Above the pod array, the marine recording was still frozen on the shuttle clearing the station unmade behind it. That last question, Dravix said, about the profiling. Yes, Maya said. He's right. Yes, Maya said again. Dravix was quiet for a moment. He looked at the frozen display. He had been in this room for decades, watching cadets fail scenarios and occasionally not fail them, and he had a particular respect for the moments that were hard to categorize, that didn't fit cleanly into the pass-fail columns of his session logs. This was one of those moments. The profiling exists, he said slowly, because several someones with significant institutional authority decided that sending non-human personnel to work alongside humans without preparation was a form of negligence. He paused. Not negligence toward the humans, negligence toward everyone else. He picked up the tablet and looked at it without reading it. That is not something we teach formally. No, Maya said, it isn't. Should we? Maya looked at the frozen display, the shuttle, the station, the dark. She did not answer. And that was its own kind of answer, the kind that opens a door instead of closing one, the kind that means the question is real and the room it leads into is large and not yet mapped. Dravik set the tablet down. He would flag the session for review. He would note the second run outcome and the cadet performance and the formal concession on record. He would note Maya's assessment, which was precise and accurate. What he would not know how to note, what would not fit in the session log fields, was the thing Krell's last question had named without quite naming, that the profiling existed to protect non-human soldiers from the shock of understanding, too late, what was standing next to them. The question of whether that was ethical was large. He decided not to try to answer it in the simulation center. Maya cleared the holographic display. The marine recording disappeared. The simulation center went back to its plain institutional geometry, 20 pods in a rough oval, the observation booth above, the side table with the water carafe, and the cup Dravik had poured and not drunk. The room looked like it always looked after a session. It did not look like a room where something had shifted. The debrief, Maya said. Full cohort 30 minutes, I'll be there. Dravik picked up the session tablet. I'll log the second run data and note the concession on record. Formally, he looked at her, with your permission. Yes, she said. He nodded and moved toward the stairs to the booth. He paused at the base of them. The question you didn't answer, he said, Krell's, about the profiling's real purpose. Yes. You're going to answer it in the debrief. It was not quite a question. Part of it, Maya said. Dravik looked at her for a moment, then climbed the stairs. The session tablet was already open in one of his lower hands. He was the kind of person who filed things accurately and completely, which meant the record of this session would be specific in ways that the Academy's standard log fields were not designed to accommodate. That was his problem for later. The debrief room was smaller than the amphitheater, a seminar space off the main simulation corridor, 16 seats around an oval table, the kind of room that had seen 1,000 post-session conversations and absorbed none of them into its walls. The cadets were already seated when Maya arrived. Dravik stood at the far end. Krell was in the seat nearest the door, his features settled into a silver that was quieter than the formal silver he had worn during the concession. More private, the color of someone still processing. Maya sat at the center of the table, not at the head of it. She set nothing on the surface in front of her. The second run, she said, what you did right. She covered it in 4 minutes. Recognition of the changed situation, trust in training, solutions native to their own biology and capability, not copied from the recording, the communication discipline, the 70% drop in verbal exchange during the critical phase, which was the metric that mattered more than the breach timing. What you did wrong, she said. The initial entry was still cautious, not at the Krell split level of caution, but the first 15 seconds of Bay 1 were 15 seconds of uncertainty you haven't trained out yet. You'll train it out, a beat. And your communication in the final shuttle push was cluttered. 3 people called the same status at the same time. In a real evacuation with 3,000 people, that's a lost second you don't get back. Sir had her tablet out and was noting both of these. Rhea was nodding. Dravik said, I'll have the full run data to each of you by end of week, time-stamped by decision point. Questions, Maya said. A cadet from the back row, Tenvil, a Vraxian who had been quiet through both the amphitheater session and the simulation, raised his hand. The scenario you built, the simultaneous triggers, the alarm and the executions, was that from the after-action file, the same incident as the recording? Yes, Maya said. Tenvil thought about this, so you designed the scenario from the outcome you were going to show us. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. You knew we would fail the first run. Yes. The room absorbed this. Not with resentment, Dravix had watched enough debrief sessions to read the difference between resentment and the particular recalibration that came from understanding, in retrospect, that a lesson had been structured rather than accidental. The cadets were doing the second reading. Krell said from his seat near the door, "You built the proof into the test." "Yes," Maya said. He looked at the table for a moment. His features were still silver. He looked up. "May I ask the question from the simulation center?" Maya looked at him. "How do you cope with it?" he said. "Carrying what you described, knowing what you are, what you've done. How do you—" He stopped and found a cleaner version of the question. "How do you continue?" The room had gone quiet the way the amphitheater had gone quiet, but differently. That quiet had been 300 people recalibrating doctrine. This was 10 people sitting with something smaller and more specific. A person who had crossed a threshold, asking another person who had crossed one how she carried the weight of crossing it. Maya did not answer immediately. She looked at the table for a moment, and then she looked at Krell. "I remember the outcome," she said. "I remember those younglings running back to their mother. I focus on the outcome, not the method. And I accept," she paused, finding the words she had used before and the words she actually meant, "that some costs are worth paying if they mean others don't have to pay them." A beat. That doesn't make it light. It makes it bearable. Krell was still. "It doesn't go away," Maya said. "I told you I still see them, all of them. That is the truth." She looked at him directly. "You should know that before you decide what kind of officer you want to be. Restraint is not just doctrine, it is also practical. Every time you pull a strike, you are protecting yourself from something you will carry forever." She paused. "That is not a weakness, it is information." Krell nodded once. His features had shifted slightly, the silver had deepened, or the shade had changed, or something in the light of the debrief room was different. Dravix could not be certain which. The Peltoran cadet, Surta, said quietly, "Does it get easier?" "It gets familiar," Maya said. "Familiar is not easier, but you learn to work alongside it." The cadets filed out in ones and twos over the next 10 minutes. Sir stopped to ask a specific question about the detonator-disabled timing that was a tactics question, not a doctrine question, and Maya answered it in the same register she answered everything else. Rhea left without speaking, which was not unfriendliness. Dravix had noticed. She processed in private and surfaced later with clean questions. Krell was the last to leave. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He did not seem to know what he wanted to say, and he did not force something into the space just to fill it. "Thank you, Lieutenant," he said finally. Then he left. Dravix and Maya were alone in the debrief room. The oval table, the 16 seats, the tablet with the session data open in his lower left hand. Outside the window, the academy grounds were running through the slow color change of late afternoon. The sky over the training fields gone from operational gray to something closer to copper. The transport pads at the far edge of the grounds lit in amber. Dravix set the tablet down. He looked at Maya, at the way she sat, even now, with the unhurried economy of someone who had finished what she came to do and was not yet decided on leaving. He had been in this room with a lot of people over a lot of years. He had a reasonable ability to read the space between what someone said and what they were holding. He crossed to where she was sitting and placed one of his 4 hands on her shoulder. "You carry heavy knowledge, Lieutenant," he said, "the kind the galaxy needs someone to carry." His voice came from somewhere low and took its time arriving, the way it always did. "You carry it responsibly. That is why you are a good teacher." Maya said nothing. She looked at the window, at the amber light on the transport pads. Dravix removed his hand. He picked up his tablet. He moved toward the door and then he stopped and said, without turning, "I'll recommend a formal curriculum review, the profiling protocol, the doctrine gap." A pause. "I won't name you as the reason, but the record will show what happened in the simulation center today, and that will be enough." "Yes," Maya said, "that will be enough." He left. Hook 29, Preclimax Mundane Beat. Maya sat at the oval table for a moment after the door closed. She reached across to the water carafe. Someone had moved from the simulation center to the debrief room. A staff member, automatic procedure. It happened between every session, and she poured a half cup. She did not drink it. She set it down and looked at it, the way you look at something your hands have done without instruction. Then she stood and walked to the observation booth. The booth above the simulation center was empty and would be for the rest of the day. The session was logged. The pods were in standby mode, their readout lights blinking at the slow rhythm of low-power status. Through the observation glass, the simulation floor below was exactly as they had left it, oval of pods, side table, the chair where Maya had stood watching Krell's team fail and then watching them not fail. The sun was lower now. Through the booth's side window, it hit the academy grounds at the angle that made everything amber and specific, the kind of light that turned ordinary things into things you would remember. Maya stood at the observation glass and looked at the floor below. 3,000 simulated lives evacuated, station gone, 6 Marines in vacuum suits, all recovered. Tours at 4 wounds, 0 civilian casualties, 6 hours of a hospital wing converted into a fortress by people who had decided, without committee, what the situation required. 30 soldiers against 300, the math that said impossible and the outcome that said otherwise. She thought about Krell's question from the simulation center doorway. The profiling isn't just to prepare the non-human personnel, is it? No, it wasn't. It was to give the people standing next to them a chance to understand, in advance, what it would mean to watch a human being cross a line that most species had drawn in a different place. To understand it before the moment, not during it. Because during it, there was no time for understanding. During it, there was only outcome. She had crossed that line once. She had come back from it. She was standing in an observation booth in a military academy, teaching a Centurion cadet and 9 others what that meant, which meant she was also one of the things the profiling was designed to prepare people for. That was a fact. She had learned to hold it the way she held the other facts. Hook 32, Echo Object. She raised her hand and touched the scars along her jaw. Felt the raised tissue under her fingers, thin lines, precise, the way marks are when they are made by something that knew exactly where to go. She had stopped noticing them most of the time. They were simply part of her face. Other people noticed them first and then stopped noticing them, and that was the natural order of things. But in this light, this amber academy afternoon light, she noticed them. They were not wounds. She had understood that for a long time without quite stating it. Wounds were things that hadn't healed. These had healed. They were something else, the physical record of a cost paid, the receipt for a transaction that could not be undone and should not be because the alternative had been worse. Not wounds. Receipts. She had carried the slavers for years. She would carry them for the rest of her career and past it, the way tours carried her 6 hours, the way every person who had crossed the threshold carried what they found on the other side. That was the doctrine honestly described. Not the weapons, not the fleet tonnage, not the plasma cannons that cracked nothing. This, the willingness to pay a cost and carry it afterward, the knowledge that the carrying was part of the agreement. In the distance, across the academy grounds, a transport ship lifted off from the landing pad. Its engines ran amber in the low light, then gold, then bright, and then it was above the light line and the sky turned dark behind it. Somewhere out there, things were stable. Somewhere out there, they were stable because someone at some point had made the calculation that made them stable, had paid the cost, had carried it home and gone on carrying it. Hook 30, Climax Triad. She thought about the yawn, the Keltine, the 12 in the dark of the Verril's promise. 3 switches, 3 costs, 3 sets of receipts. The transport was gone. The sky above the academy grounds was the color that came after amber, the color that had no common name, the last color before dark. She stood at the observation glass a moment longer. Below her, the simulation floor was still and empty. The standby lights blinked their slow rhythm. The side table held the water carafe and the cup she had poured in the debrief room. It had made its way here too, by the same automatic procedure, staff doing what staff did between sessions. The cup was still half full. She had never drunk from it. Hook 33, final image. She turned from the glass. At the door of the observation booth she paused, her hand on the frame. Behind her, through the side window, the last of the amber light touched the Academy's training fields, hundreds of cadets from dozens of species, running drills in the long shadows, training to serve in a system that was imperfect and working and necessary. The galaxy was peaceful. Everyone in it understood, at some level, what the cost of that peace had been. Most of them did not know the specific names or the specific prices. They knew the 80 years of quiet. They knew the treaty clauses written in careful language by people who had seen something and wanted to make sure it was never forgotten. She had made sure of one more room today. She touched the doorframe and stepped through. The galaxy is peaceful because everyone understands the cost. We made sure they understood.